Hi, magandang gabi sa inyo. Welcome sa ating another topic, a very something interesting and very somehow controversial, not only in philosophy but even in theology. It's about human freedom and responsibility. So we will try to see and somehow define freedom and see the connections of these two basic ideas about freedom at the same time responsibility. We are going to somehow ask a simple question whether they are really a foe or a friend. Sila ba ay magkaibigan o magkaaway? Okay, let's see. Human freedom and responsibility. People are taught to be responsible for many of the things that they do. A person is normally responsible for the action of stealing a watch from a department store, but someone else is not responsible for breaking a display case if the thief pushes him against it. So, a different situation, a different scenario, but normally they have a different accountability. One somehow would be very responsible because he steals still a watch in a department store, while the other one also committed somehow an offense, breaking a display case. But the later person or the last one is not actually responsible. Why? Because according to our slide, because a thief pushes him against it. So let's continue. Despite these clear-cut cases, there are difficult cases in which people disagree about whether someone should be held fully responsible for something that he does. So philosophers have attempted to specify what sorts of factors make someone responsible. So that's the basic question. Sabi dito, what sort of factors that would make someone responsible for what he does? So, kailan siya nagkakaroon ng pananagutan? Kailan siya nawawala ng pananagutan? In spite of the fact, like our example, that both of them are actually committed an offense. So, there is a continuing debate about what type of freedom persons may have and how this affects responsibility. So, here we are going to see the connection of human freedom and responsibility. Okay, so in understanding the connection of freedom and responsibility, the author actually give us the two general types of human action. So we have the voluntary and involuntary action. So let's begin with the voluntary action. So according to this author, it is a behavior that is in your control. So take note of that. You are in control of a particular behavior. So that would be considered as voluntary action. So they are the things that you do willingly, and it's usually called pre-action. So when we say voluntary action, it's a pre-action. So what makes something voluntary is that you have these two things. Number one, you have the some sense of what you are doing. So you have the knowledge, you have the senses of what you are doing. And second, you have the consent to do it. So you have the decision, meaning you want to do it. You decide after knowing, after understanding the possible effects of your action, so you finally decide to act on it. So in our legal system of criminal law and morality, people are responsible only, so take note of that, only for the voluntary actions and their results. So what normally people would understand to be the results of the voluntary action. So other people and legal authorities can rightfully hold you responsible. So you have a responsibility only if your behavior was in your control. So that's again the repeated word. You are in control. So the question is when responsibility or accountability lies Okay, so responsibility for actions requires more than understanding what you are doing. But as I said, you have the consent to do it. Okay, so you have to consent to act while being able not to consent. So you decide, although you have the ability, the chances not to consent or not to decide or not to act. Okay? So responsibility for a voluntary action requires that you can actually choose not to do it. So meron ka kakayahan na hindi gawin, pero pinili mo pa rin na gawin siya. So that's contrary on an opposite do sa last part. Sabi diyan, if someone acts voluntarily, meaning you are the one doing it, you are not a robot, you are not being dictated or being somehow totally controlled, but sabi rito, is not able to choose not to do it. So medyo difficult part yun. Sabi lang, but is not able to choose not to do it. So nawalan ka ng kakayahan na piliin na hindi gawin. So as if you lose the idea of control, the pre-action. So wala kang choice kung hindi gawin siya kasi wala ka ng pagpipilian kung hindi gawin siya. That's why ang sabi diyan, you are not able to choose not to do it. Meaning your only choice is to do it. And with that, sabi diyan, that person is not responsible for it. Okay, let's go with the second type of human action as we connect it with human freedom and responsibility. Human bodies do many things that are not voluntary actions. Why? Because the person does not control. So that's the keywords, does not control what is done. So like the natural occurrence of situations like the beating of your heart and the digestion of your food. So in general, anything your body does not do, not realize, so that's the first one, does not realize or do not realize it doing, or that you do not consent. So this is totally an opposite of the first one, the voluntary action, wherein we have a full responsibility. O in Tagalog, meron tayong pananagutan because that would be considered as voluntary action. Why? Because of two things. Number one, you have the understanding. Okay? Opposite with this involuntary action, you do not realize. Okay? And secondly, you do not consent to do. So that would be considered as involuntary or not voluntary actions. And as if it appears compared with the voluntary action, in involuntary action, because you do not realize it without really understanding the situation, the possible effects, at the same time followed by not consenting it or not really deciding to do it or allowing it, so you do not a full responsibility. So according to Aristotle, there are two possible reasons why these things or this action we consider as involuntary usually happen. So number one, we have ignorance, and number two, because of compulsion. So let's go with number one. This is what we call as ignorance. If you do not understand the circumstances in which you are acting, so take note, nandoon na naman yung tinatawag nating sabi dyan, if you do not understand. So iba-iba lang yung ginagamit, realize, okay? So then sabi dyan, in which you are acting, or likely the causal results, the possible effects of your immediate movements. So you probably do not know what you are doing. Okay, so if you do not know that, example, scratching your nose is an obscene gesture or somehow offending to some culture, okay, so in a particular society, you do not realize that it insults other people, it would lead to a possibility that you do not have accountability. So wala kang pananagutan because exactly, of course, yung possible at immediate results no, naka-open ka na, nagkaroon ng responsibility. Pero if you try to analyze it as according to Aristotle as somehow involuntary action because you do not you do not have the full understanding of the particular culture. At the same time, after understanding it, ay sinadya mo talaga na maka-offend. So you have a lesser responsibility because of that what we called as ignorance. Okay, aside from the first thing under involuntary action, ignorance, we have number two, compulsion. So under compulsion, we have the external and the internal. So let's go first with the external. It usually exists according to the source, our source, the author, when a person is forced to do something that she does not do it out of her own free will. So, according to Aristotle, we can consider an action to be compulsory when it originates in external cause to which the doer contributes nothing. Okay? So, in Tagalog, as in, wala siyang magagawa kundi sumunod. Like, we have here the example, a sea captain that does not follow his course because a storm blows his ship, of course, off course. Okay? So, meaning out of her own original plan. Even kahit gamitin niya all of his power, wala siyang magagawa. And that's the reason why, even according to Aristotle, we can never consider some example like threats and other unusual circumstances that force you to do something that you would not do otherwise as the same example with the sea captain. So, hindi natin pwedeng ituring yon na under this category of compulsion and involuntary. So, halimbawa, inold up ka, ikaw ay tinakot, that would still be considered as voluntary kasi you still have the power kahit i-reject yun at pwede kang lumaban. So, compared with the example of a sea captain. Okay, so another one is we have what we call as internal. So, kung ang external, it's outside the forces, no, outside forces that would really make us to do something even out of our own free will. Okay, so ang internal naman, it's more of inside the body. And most of the time, under compulsion, some would really give us the example, yung mga mentally retarded. That's why I have there the picture. Okay, so let's read. It removes a person's ability to choose. So, dun na sa first sentence, that is something very clear. It occurs when some inner psychological factor forces a person to act. An extraordinary fear of heights may force someone to cancel her flight. So even, of course, the best example, as I said, is a mental illness. Some would also give us the example of those who are involved in drugs. So that would be considered as internal compulsion. Okay, so in some religious, moral, and legal system, people have been held responsible for what they did, regardless of whether it was voluntary. So this is called a strict liability. So of course, mas strict when it comes to morality in some religious organization and in some legal system, like in Islam and other legal system existing in society. So according to Peter McNerney, within this system, the person is responsible for her or his behavior, whether or not it was her or his control. So a person might be held responsible by God. So that would involve a supernatural beyond our humanistic understanding. Okay, so a priest or believers for violating a command not to visit a sacred island, even if her or his boat were blown there by a storm, if she or he did not know about the command. So sabi nga nila, ignorance of the law excuses no one. So that would be the included in our first example, and also here in internal, as in there is a strict commandment based on some religious organization. So whether you know it or not, you committed it, whether you are aware of your offenses, you will be responsible in that particular with that particular actions. Okay, as we move on, let's go with the second topic under the discussion on the connection of freedom and human responsibility. After discussing about the two major types of human action, the voluntary and involuntary, we move on the three major views on human freedom. Actually, I consider this as the main part of the discussion about human freedom. So, although this is something very difficult compared with the first one about the classification or types of human action. So, we have here the source. We have Dr. Hunter Mead, who gives us the three major views on one of the hottest philosophical and even, I could say, theological debate on human freedom. Okay, so as we move on with our second major topic about the different major views on human freedom. So let's go first with the fatalism view. So the word actually fatal, or this view of fatalism, came from the Latin word fatum, which simply means that which God ordains to happen. Some would really refer to it as the iron law of fate, or in Philippine culture we have what we call tadhana. So the sad thing about this view is this, that there is no means of altering. When we say altering, baguhin mo. So ano man yung tinadhana sa iyo, isinulat na, wala kang kahit gustuhin mo out of your own desire and decision, you can no longer change it. So that's the negative, the sad part of this view. That's why it's called the iron law of fate. So sometimes expressed poetically in some poem, even before the Enlightenment period, they called it as one's destiny, as actually written in the stars. Okay, so there is somehow supernatural involved with this. Okay, so in Islam, they have the term kismet. So used to express a comparable doctrine that the term is frequently, though not very accurately, okay, translated as it is written. So that's what we call as fatalism view. The second one, with the three major views on human freedom, is what we call as determinism, indeterminism view. Okay, so that's the negative. You have the negative two letters, indeterminism. So this is somehow the opposite of the first one. Okay, so throughout the history, this is somehow the popular view before. Okay, so the official view of the Western thought. So many indeterminists such as Immanuel Kant have actually argued that no matter what decision we are trying to make, and regardless how difficult it may reach, when we finally decide, we have the feeling that the choice is undetermined. Okay, so if you have the first one, everything is actually according to the tadhana in Tagalog, to the fate. Okay, the iron law of fate. So here in indeterminism, that's the opposite side. Everything is undetermined. That's why we have the negative in. Okay, so in Filipino culture, sabi nila, you are the one who actually, in Tagalog, ikaw yung gumagawa ng tadhana, hindi outside your own body or your decision, but ikaw mismo sa sarili mo. So this is what we call indeterminism view. That's why you have there the highlighted word, the uncaused choices, unpredictability, and genuine novelty. Meaning, everything that you decide is actually unrelated, unconnected with the previous decision or uh, experiences that you have. So this is actually hard to sustain, because we could somehow really say na everything that usually happens, even a smaller and smaller portion, whether physically or even psychologically and biologically, they are all connected. So ang negative side ng part na to ay para bang as if everything could be decided totally unrelated and connected. Walang kaugnayan, walang connection dun sa yung mga kahit maliliit o malalaking decision in the past. So that's why later on it was actually opposed by most scholars even during the Enlightenment period. So the keyword here is undetermined, uncause. So walang connection, walang hindi nakakaapekto ano man yung mga decision nating malilit before, mga karanasan before. So kaya mahirap i-sustain yung ganitong konsepto na as if maiisip mo na yon at makakapag-decision ka based lang doon sa yung present experiences and situation without really connecting it and somehow influence outside the present situation or conditions that you have. Okay, so that's what we call as indeterminism. Totally undetermined, everything that you decide is totally unconnected with the past, whether minor or major decision, minor or major experiences. Okay, now let's go with the third view. So let's review. The first one, we have a fatalism view as if there is no complete freedom because everything is determined. You do not have the ability to decide on the present because everything was actually determined by an impersonal force or even by gods or whatever, okay, outside your own will. Okay, then the second one, you have a complete freedom as if there is no connection between your past and your present decision. So and remember when we discuss about freedom, we are actually discussing about our experiences, the past, and connecting it with the present. So with number two, as expounded by indeterminism, they are actually disconnecting. Okay, the past, the environment, the culture in the past with your present decision. As if you decided based on sa yung present feelings and present experiences. That's why yung number two, the indeterminism, as if it appears complete freedom. Okay, complete freedom in a sense that there is no connection between your past experiences, the environment, and even your internal experiences, your family background, and other things. And that's the reason why the although before that was actually popular, but later on it was actually opposed and not really accepted by most scholar. So then we come up with this third view, what we call as the determinism view. So determinism is the theory that all events are actually cause, is actually cause or determined. That's why we called it determinism view. By antecedent, when we say antecedent, what is actually happened in the past. Okay, so antecedent conditions. Okay, whatever, so sabi rito, whatever happens is caused to happen by previous facts. Nothing happens by mere chance. So yun yung sinasabi ng indeterminism. So everything happens by mere chance, a novelty, that's originality, totally not connected with the previous experiences. So there are laws of nature according to which whatever happens, happens because of what happened before. Ito naman yung sinasabi ng determinism, as if there is total connection. Okay, so if we know that these laws of nature and the antecedent, so when we say antecedent, the condition or the experiences before, okay, that's the simple meaning of that word. So we can know what will happen. In principle, we could know beforehand about a particular event. So determinism is widely accepted in most areas of natural science as pioneered by Thomas Hobbes and of course Spinoza and other scholars mentioned here. Okay, so you also have Benedict Spinoza. Okay, this is actually a revolt against indeterminism position. Maybe in natural science, it would be possible, okay? Because of some discoveries, because of some natural laws, okay, we can predict. But if we try to relate it with human experience and human freedom, that would be something hard to sustain, mahirap i-sustain at paniwalaan. Siguro sa natural science, possibly, kasi we could, although not even 100%, kahit nga yung mga position ng moons and anything, even weather, ano, siguro when it comes to weather, mas malaki yung percentage ng determinism. That's why ito'y naging popular during the time din ng pag-usbong ng tinatawag natin study of natural science. Ang problem ay ikinonect nila to sa human freedom. Okay? So, ako, ang position ko, I agree, when it comes to natural science, we could somehow, although sabi ko nga, not 100% pa rin, kasi kahit sa science, even nga ang weather, di ba? They can not really determine. Minsan, sasabihin nila ganito, but all of a sudden, merong a small percentage na hindi pa rin mangyayari. But ang ating discussion ngayon ay is about human freedom, and that is some more complex, more difficult to determine. Okay? And that's why in determinism view, we have two major position, and we will try to connect it with our main lesson about freedom and responsibility. So in hard determinism, philosophers have disagreed about the exact conditions that are necessary for responsibility. So that's why we called it hard determinism, because this is a position that people are not responsible for their actions and decisions. Why? Because these are causally determined. Kung yan ay, kaya nga hard determinism, kung yan ay tinadana na, determine na, whether like in natural science, so ganun din sa tao, kung lahat na magiging kilos niya ay determined na, predictable na, okay, so mawawalan siya ng responsibility, hindi siya, mawawalan siya ng pananagutan, dahil ang may kasalanan nun ay yung kanyang nakaraan. So in sociology, kung i-apply to lalo na sa psychology during the time of Sigmund Freud, so sinasabi nila, di ba, that's somehow a notion of hard determinism, yung sinasabi nila kapag ang background mo ganitong pamilya ay ganito magiging buhay mo. Pero of course, we can disprove that, dahil merong mga tao kahit galing sa broken family, hindi mo pwedeng i-predict 100% na ganito yung magiging status ng buhay nila. Okay? So, ito yung sinasabi ng hard determinism. Dahil kung yan lahat ay determined na, wala silang pananagutan. Kasi yan ay kasalanan at yan ay pananagutan nung kanilang mga nakaraang karanasan. So, kaya sa hard determinism, tinatanggal yung kanyang pananagutan, yung kanyang responsibility. So, kaya sabi yan, hard determinists think that the free will is necessary for being responsible. So, as if nawawala ng free will, kasi ang nagdi-decide kung anong gagawin mo, even your crime to be committed, ay kung ano yung nakaraan mo. Okay? So, and with that, this power to choose, dahil wala nga, determined na, ay nawawalan ka ng pananagutan. So, sabi diyan, because the person's able to choose only one alternative, so, isa lang yung choice mo kasi determined na yon, depende dun sa nakaraan mo. So, matatanggalan ng tinatawag nating responsibility. Okay? Then, we have what we call as soft determinism. So, soft determinism, it is the position that people are responsible. So, that's the basic difference. So, sa hard determinism, tsaka sa soft determinism. Ngayon, ang tanong nyo, ano pagkakaiba nung hard determinism pagdating dun sa fatalism? Ano? Sa fatalism, as if you totally lose, as if you become a robot. Okay? Dito, you still decide sa hard determinism, but yung decision mo is primarily based pa rin dun sa yung nakaraan. Okay? So, yung fatalism, it's more of, kaya nga sabi nila, that's the most extreme belief. Kasi as if you totally lose your freedom, as if you become a robot. So dito sa hard determinism, you are still the one deciding. Yun nga lang, very predictable everything that you decide. Kasi based dun sa yung nakaraan. So, ang problema lang, as I emphasize, siguro, pagdating dito sa hard determinism, kasi sinubukan nilang i-apply kung ano yung nakita nila sa natural science, in-apply nila sa human freedom, which is more complex. Okay? So, sa natural science, pwede nilang ma-predict yun. Although, as I emphasized before, hindi pa rin ganun 100%. Okay? So, ang masakit doon, dahil hard determinism, nawawalan na nga ng tinatawag nating accountability o pananagutan. Okay? At yun ang inilagay sa soft determinism. That's why it's called soft. Ano? So, kung kanina hard, strong, ano? Yung kanilang paninindigan at yung will as in totally determined. So, dito sa soft determinism, ito rin tinatawag nating compatibilism. Kaya tawag tong compatibilism, you still have the freedom, you have the free will, but hindi itinatanggal yung tinatawag nating accountability o pananagutan. Okay? So, let's continue. Sabi dito, soft determinists think that responsibility for an action requires only that a person does what she decided to do. So, soft determinism is also called compatibilism because it claims that freedom, but not the traditional free will, is compatible with determinism. So, freedom of action is being able to do what you want and decide to do. So, freedom of choice is deciding in a normal way without either external or inner compulsion. So, yun yung sinasabi nating the freedom of choice. Kaya basically, when we say freedom in philosophical discussion, it simply means you can really decide, you can process, ano, kaya mong magdesisyon, kaya mong iproseso ano man yung iyong gagawing decision. Okay? Kaya ang sa philosophy, ang talagang issue na is the degree. We all have the freedom because we can really process everything. Kaya nating pag-isipan ano yung gagawin natin, we can even determine yung possible na magiging results. Okay? Pero at the end, kung ating titignan, ay it's all a matter of degree. Kasi minsan, di ba, meron tayong kasabi na parang you lose your freedom, though not totally. What you are referring is you lose your control. So, depende dun sa degree ng situation. Kapag totally nagalit ka, hindi na wala ang freedom mo. But somehow, yung degree to control yourself and to somehow reflect what will be the outcome of your decision ay medyo na lessen because nadala ka ng sitwasyon, ng pagkakataon, but just the same, you still the freedom. Why and how we define freedom? Freedom is simply your ability to process your thoughts, your decision. Okay? So, it's only a matter of degree. Minsan, merong pagkakataon na kaya nating i-evaluate pa. Pero minsan, dahil sa, sabi nga nila, yung init ng sitwasyon, nawawala yung kakayahan mo to really process what would be the possible outcome. So, let's continue. Sabi dito, many self-determinists argue that psychological determinism is not only compatible with but also necessary for responsibility. So, mamaya titignan natin yung tinatawag nating psychological determinism. So, they argue that an action must derive causally from a person's character, so personality, for the person to be responsible. So, yung sinasabi nating soft determinism. So, yung connection pa rin, yung personality mo in the past and even your background ay would really determine what would be your possible actions, the present or even the future. Okay, that's what we call as psychological determinism. Okay, so it was known as the moderate determinist emphasizes much of self-determinism, which indicates that an action are the result of our character. So, yung tinatawag nating self-determinism. So, lahat ng kilos natin, meron siyang, in Tagalog, meron siyang, sa palasak na salita natin ngayon, meron siya pa rin pinaghuhugutan. Okay? So, previous decision and experiences. So, human has moral freedom, which leads to his moral responsibility. Okay, after discussing yung somehow a very difficult part, the three major views on human freedom, we will now move with the somehow a very light discussion. This is actually taken from the book usually being used now in senior high school from Dr. Roberto Abella in Introduction to Philosophy of the Human Person. What he actually discussed there is only the three kinds of freedom, and somehow the connection, again, as we emphasized, of freedom to responsibility. Okay, so if we already understand the discussion before about the three major views, this is a very light part naman at this time. Okay, so we have the three kinds of human freedom. Okay, the three kinds of freedom according to Dr. Abella. This is actually taken again from the main textbook being used in senior high school. So, number one, we have physical freedom. It refers to the absence of any physical restraint. So, the person has the freedom of mobility to go where he or she wants to go. He or she is not impeded in his or her actions by any physical force. So we already discussed this. This is somehow the external part. That's why when we discuss about human freedom, this is actually the most highlighted part because when we say freedom, when I tried to ask this before in some of to some of my students, they would really somehow define freedom as the ability to do whatever you want, ano? So that would be highly associated with this what we call as physical freedom. So sabi dito, granted that the person has natural limitation, physical freedom allows him or her to act or move in a determined manner. So you cannot be everywhere at once, of course. But freedom allows you to move from one place to another and to go whenever you want to go. So that would be the first kinds of freedom, and actually the most highlighted and common way of seeing of classifying freedom. Then next we have the psychological. So it is called freedom of choice. Okay, the person is free to perform actions that he or she considers right and wise. So a person is also free to act or not to act. In fact, even your choice not to act is also a freedom. Okay, so that would be called a psychological freedom. So this is something innate, meaning innate. This is something natural in us, okay, and cannot be denied a person. So no outside force or influence can compel a person to take actions against his or her will. So even yung pag inaalok tayo ng mga produkto, di ba? That's psychological freedom. Hindi tayo pwedeng gawing robot na pilitin tayo. Kaya nga ang exemption daw, we lose freedom when we do not have the ability to process, di ba? When we are hypnotized. So that's some of the most common exemption and somehow an example of answering a question, when is the time that we lose freedom? When we are hypnotized, di ba? Kaya nga kahit alokin tayo, kahit gaano kagaling yung speaker, whether in religion or whether in a certain product, we still have the psychological freedom because at the end we have the ability to decide unless we are hypnotized. So wala na tayong kakayahan na mag-decide. So kaya nga aside dun sa internal sabi natin compulsion na whether with the influence of drugs, 'di ba? Or whether you are mentally ill. So isa pang madalas na sinasabi nila na somehow metaphysical, meaning a supernatural situation, yung tinatawag nating hypnotism. Okay? So that's psychological freedom. And last, of course, we have what we call as moral freedom. So, dito na papasok yung tinatawag nating connection ng freedom sa responsibility. So, it refers to using freedom in a manner that uphold human dignity and goodness. So, freedom is not an object that a person may use in whatever way he or she pleases. So, humans have a natural inclination. Okay, so take note of that, for what is true and good. And when a person uses his or her freedom to do acts that violate human dignity and goodness, he or she dehumanizes himself or herself and effectively negates human freedom. Because sabi ko nga, yung most common definition of freedom is simply the ability to do whatever you want. Pero madalas ang basic question ko, sige, nagawa mo lahat ng yan. Pero internally, because alam mo nagawa mo ay mali, di ba? Uusigin ka ng konsensya mo. That would also somehow a limitation of freedom. Kasi kukonsensyahin ka, okay? So doon papasok yung connection ng freedom sa responsibility. Sige, nagawa mo lahat ng gusto mo, pero that would violate what is right, di ba? What is yung connection, yung understanding mo dun sa tinatawag nating morality. And that would somehow affect yung tinatawag nating freedom. Why? Kasi guguluhin ka, di ba? Yung somehow yung tinatawag nating conscience, yun ang magkukulong sa'yo para pwedeng hindi ka rin magawa, hindi mapuntahan because of your offenses to some particular people at some particular places. Okay? So, titingnan pa natin yan dito sa ating last slide about how we could really responsibly use our freedom as according to Dr. Okay, we now here in the last part of our slide of our discussion. I think the most practical in sermon, this is I consider as the application. Okay, of course the lighter side of the discussion. So this is based or taken from again from Dr. Roberto Abella. So responsible use of freedom. This is the most important question. How can I exercise my freedom in a responsible and beneficial manner? So number one, human freedom should be exercised with control and recognition of reasonable limits. So we set limits to our freedom and learn to moderate or control our thoughts, emotions, actions depending on the situation. So this is what we call as the most basic responsible use of our freedom. We should know our limitation. Okay, the recognition and control, because one of the most basic nature of man is we have the rational ability, the intellectual side. Okay, so that's why it is emphasized here, the recognition of reasonable limits. Number two, freedom should also be exercised with regard for knowledge and truth. So we use our freedom to act and acquire more knowledge and uses this knowledge in order to come up with decisions and courses of action when confronted with difficult situations. So aside from our nature as rational being, we have the nature as moral being that's associated with our freedom. So we always exercise freedom in regards with that nature, always with the use of our knowledge of what is right and what is wrong, especially in a very difficult decision making and different course of action. So last but not the least, we should recognize and uphold not only our individual freedom but also freedom of others. So in number one, we emphasize man's nature as intellectual being, our ability to recognize the limitation. Number two, always associated with our moral being, the ability to determine what is right and what is wrong. Here in the third part is our nature as social being. So the basic question is when our freedom begins and ends. So the basic answer is that my freedom ends when other freedoms begins. Okay, because we are a social being, and that would limit our ability to extend our freedom. And that's why it was emphasized here that freedom should be exercised with due regard for the welfare of others, of other persons. And one's freedom should be exercised not as a tool to restrict the freedom of others, but as a means to enjoy others to fully enjoy their own freedom. Okay, so that's all.